I'm so excited to welcome you to the Writer Center Virtual Craft Chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little more about how they wrote it. My name is Emily Holland. I'm the editor of Poet Lore, and I'm so thrilled to have Dan Brady joining us as tonight's guest. Dan, hello.
Hello.
So great to see you. Just to get us started, do you have a copy of the book handy? And would you mind reading a page or two or a poem? My copy actually just came in today, so we are, perfect timing. And I saw Amy posted the link, so everyone, if you don't have a copy already, please order a copy. But Dan, if you could just kick us off with maybe a few pages of some of your work, that would be lovely.
Sure. So this is my new book, Subtext, which came out the end of February. And I'm going to start off, I think, just with the first poem in the book, which I don't think I've read before in any of the readings I've been doing. So this will be fun. So this is called Face to Face. Now that you can read my eyes, there is nothing between us, just a feeling we cannot know. Now that we are here, you can read everything in my eyes, misunderstanding us. There is no us, no speech, just a feeling, a sense we cannot know each other. Now that we are here face to face, you can read everything I mean in my eyes. There can be no misunderstanding between us when there is nothing between us. No hazy medium of speech, just presence and feeling, and a quiet sense that we truly cannot know each other. There can be no misunderstanding when there is no speech, just a quiet that we can know. We are here, we know each other. That's just the poem that kicks off the book.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. And again, please, please, please order a copy of the book. You will not regret it. It is amazing and something that I found myself just returning to multiple times after I read through it the first time. So I'm super excited to have you with us, Dan. Our first question tonight is just going to be kind of basic before we get to the really difficult first question. So could you just tell us who you are and what brings you to poetry?
Sure. So who I am, I'm Dan Brady. I'm the author of two books that are out so far. One called Strange Children and a second book called Subtexts, which is the new book that just came out. I very recently found out that my third book will be coming out probably the end of this year from Transfer Books, which will be called Songs in E. So I'm excited about that. And I'm the poetry editor for Barrelhouse, which is a magazine and small press based in the DC area. I've done a lot of things in my life. I've worked for the Academy of American Poets and the National Endowment for the Arts and a bunch of other arts organizations. And I live in Arlington, Virginia. I have a wife and two kids and a little black dog. So that's me.
Great. And congratulations on your third book. That's so exciting. We will obviously want to have you back to dive into that one. And yeah, I really feel like poets, we always have to wear a lot of different hats, right? We do a lot of different things that aren't just poetry, so that we can do the poetry.
Right.
So thank you for that. Okay, so now to our real first question. So poets, we're in the business of noticing things, and I think sometimes it's hard to look back on our own work and find what we notice about that. So is there something that you notice about your work that goes unnoticed by others, or is there a question that you really wish someone would ask you about your work that no one's ever asked before?
Right. So I don't know if other people notice this or not, but something I've been thinking about lately is how my work, I think, is kind of hopeful by principle. It dives into darker topics and themes, but at the end, it always kind of finds a way to bend back towards the light. And I think as a writer, I feel a bit of a kind of responsibility to do that. I just think about myself when I found poetry in high school and, was reading all of this stuff that is essentially a call out of pain and different feelings. And it's a question of does anyone else feel this way? And you as the reader, hopefully can meet the poem there and answer yes, I understand. And thinking back on myself, it's important to me that I encountered those feelings, but also know there's this hope in being together with the poet and with other people. So I don't think I've ever written a completely bleak despair poem. Maybe I should try, but I kind of feel like I don't want to. I like that they're all hopeful in the end.
Yeah, that's important, what you were saying about sort of the conversation that poetry creates between poet and reader, or poet and other poets. And I do appreciate that you touch upon so many different themes that I think we'll talk about later tonight, but it's never with a sense of abject despair, right? There's always some hope, and maybe something in the form, especially with subtexts, something in that sort of self-erasure, accumulative form that you're playing with lends itself to that a little bit too, in a way. Just to remind everyone, don't be afraid to pop questions in the chat. As much as I love to ask my own questions, I love to ask yours more. So keep them flowing as you think of them. So I did want to start just talking a little bit about the form of this book, because it's a little bit unusual and I think is key to the way a lot of the other craft elements in the poems are really interacting. So this is a book with long poems that are erasures, self-erasures, maybe they accumulate and erase again. Could you just give a short explanation of what erasure is, and then maybe talk about your specific approach to these poems in particular?
Yeah, so typically an erasure poem takes a found existing text, which could be anything, a book, a newspaper article, the Declaration of Independence, whatever you find, and starts kind of blacking out or taking away pieces of language to leave a few things behind that form a new poem. So that's generally the way you'd encounter an erasure poem. And I kind of took that method, but applied it a bit differently. I would write an original text instead of using a found text, and then erase myself over and over again. So there's several pages, usually about 5 to 6 pages, that are erasures of the same original text. And like Emily was saying, some of them kind of start small and build out to a big prose block that's a full page, and then some deteriorate down to just a couple words. So I used a couple different approaches, but all the erasure technique is kind of the same throughout the book.
So when you were first starting these poems, did you approach that original piece of text with the notion that you were going to end up erasing it, or did it sort of come about given the subject matter, the themes? I'm just curious about how the project sort of came to be.
Yeah, so the project started because I saw these paintings by a French painter named Eugene Leroy, who would start with a basic image like a portrait and then just keep adding layers and layers of paint until you couldn't really tell what the portrait was a picture of. And I thought that was really interesting. And I wanted to figure out if I could do something like that in poetry. And with Erasure, I already knew there was like the original text and then the new layer of the text you create. So I thought maybe I can just push that to the extreme and keep doing it. So I wrote the original text with the intention of erasing it, which I wasn't too aware as I was doing it, but I did have to think about like, I can't use too many words that are so obscure that I would never find another reason to include it in the poem. So there was kind of like a balancing act to do, knowing that I would want to erase these later.
Right, right. That's really interesting because I'm thinking of maybe the ones like the fossil record where I could tell once you got to sort of the prose block, you could see that some of the strategy was to erase part of the word itself so that, you know, you wouldn't see Titanosaurus, but you would see Titan. And so that's really sort of innovative in the way that you don't know the full context until you get there. And then you're like, oh, and then you sort of are pushed to keep reading and then go back to it. And that kind of leads me to ask a little bit about sort of the longer form that these poems take. So how did you sort of approach the length of the poems themselves? Like, was there a moment when you were like, is this too long? Like, how far do you push it? And how do you kind of know when the form is sort of desiring to be in that long state?
Yeah. I think like page to page, I would ask myself, is this next page doing enough different to warrant being its own page? Or should I just kind of skip that step and go to the next version of it? And there were times where I thought something was done and I showed it to a friend and they were like, I think you could fit like 3 or 4 more pages in here. And I would try it and sometimes it would work, sometimes it wouldn't. So it kind of depend on the poem. And then every time I did that, it would change the meaning of the poem. If I inserted more or less or took out pages, it would kind of change the flow of the whole thing. So the length was organic to each poem, but I didn't really have a strict method for how to determine what the length should be, I guess.
Yeah, sort of you feel it in the bones. I like thinking about them, you know, is it doing enough differently, especially with a form like this, because with such a kind of extended project throughout the book, it could easily have been just one poem continuously sort of differently erased. But I think that you give us so much here by having those sequences there. Let me go into the chat because it looks pretty vibrant. So we'll pop to some other questions now. Judy's asking, what words of wisdom do you have for educators trying to hook students into poetry?
Yeah, I see the question after that. Is this also called blackout poetry? With erasure and blackout poetry are the same technique. So in terms of educators, I feel like my approach to a poem is more like how most people would view a piece of visual art, where the experience of it is the primary thing. You walk up to it, you see what's there, your mind and your body have a reaction to those elements, and then later you think about what those elements mean together and kind of create a meaning for the painting. I think that approach to poetry, first just letting the poem kind of wash over you, and what sounds do you hear, what senses are activated, that's a helpful way in, because you don't need to understand what the poem is trying to do. You just intuitively get it. Like, this poem is making me feel this way, sad or happy or what have you. And then the next step would be, well, how is the poem doing that? And what is the meaning of the work? I feel like when I was in school, meaning was always the primary thing. And certainly that's good because you do need to understand what the poem is saying. But I think taking that step back and enjoying the poem first is what leads people to understand the pleasure of poetry.
That's great. Yeah. Starting with that emotional level versus that sort of analytical level, right? I think a lot of people are like, I don't get poetry. It's too difficult. I don't get what it means. But if you ask them, well, does it make you feel something? They probably would easily have an answer to that too. So that's great. Kaylin is asking, what poets got you into poetry and helped shape your writing?
That's interesting. I mean, the earliest poets that I got into when I was in high school were a lot of the beat poets, Ginsberg and Ferlinghetti and those types of folks. And then sort of branched out into contemporary poetry, Billy Collins and that, Mary Oliver, those folks who were very popular. And then from there, just kept digging back to find different influences and people doing different things. And I was, totally hooked and read everything I could. Who has shaped my writing the most? I think there's a couple of people. Jack Gilbert is like my all-time favorite. I think his work is amazing, both for the way he writes and how it makes me feel. Mattia Harvey, who blurbed this book, is a real hero of mine. I feel like she's kind of fearless and playful and will do anything. I feel like she doesn't think about publishing. She just thinks about creating something interesting, which is a really inspiring approach to me. So those are kind of my two, poles that I look at, like a great writer that affects me, and then someone who is bold and doing interesting things. And I would like to do all of that if I can. So. The
middle of that Venn diagram. That's great. And then Shaheen is asking about the visual layout of the poem. So is the visual layout of the Erasure poems important, or do you focus on how the remaining words sound? And this is something I kind of wanted to ask about too, because there's different approaches to erasure. And in some places, I could see that the words remained in the same positions in that sort of prose block, even when some of it was erased. So yeah, if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think for those prose block poems that then are erased down, the visual aspect was important to me in a way, just because I think it's a neat trick that I kind of came up with. And as I was reading the poems, before any of them got published, and like at a reading, I would have them on the sheets of paper and people would be interested in how it worked. And then they would come up and see that the words were all in the same place. And they were like, wow, okay. So I was like, all right, I'm gonna hold on to that. People seem to like that. Does that impact the meaning of the poems? Maybe, maybe not. I feel like in the Fossil Record poem, maybe it does, because you are talking about animal fossils in how they're situated in the earth. So I feel like there's a layer of that there. Many of the other poems in this book use these techniques, but they are more compact and lineated, more like traditional poems. So there, maybe the sound and the line breaks are more important than in the prose laid out poems.
Great. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up line breaks or just the line in general, because that's, like the building block of poetry. And I think part of the joys of reading this book and reading your work in general is just the way that your lines are so well crafted. There's surprise. You kind of never know exactly what's coming next. And I think the poem that you read for us, the first two lines do kind of what I'm talking about, where now that you can read, and then the next line starts, my eyes, you're not really, that's not what you're expecting. And I think is just beautiful. And with the erasure, you sort of force the reader to go back and re-examine the context in the different moments. So could you talk about your approach to crafting the line, maybe in Erasure, but also just in general, how you approach those different enjambments, lineation, prose poems. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think with this book, I needed to make some choices to make it work for myself. So there's pretty much no punctuation throughout the book. And that was a choice so that I could have a line start with one phrase on one page and end with a different one, and then change it up on the next page and not be stuck with a period or a comma interrupting the flow. I wanted the freedom of rearranging what those breaks would be. I think in the subtext poems and also in my poems generally, I tend to prefer a sort of phrase or breath kind of based line. I just find that works best. I don't know why. I feel like you want, like you were saying, the surprise at the end of the line. You want there to be a moment where the reader has to pause or breathe, and they don't know how the phrase is going to resolve itself. And that's your opening, that you can create something special or surprising. I think for lineated poems, I feel like every line kind of needs to earn its own place with an interesting image or a bit of language that like makes that line special. It needs to be doing some work to keep the reader's attention. But yeah, I think the primary thing for me with the line is that sense of like, what is going to come next? And can the reader predict it? Because if they can predict it, then maybe you should try something a little more interesting to keep them going.
Yeah. I also like that idea of, making the line do some work for to earn the place. I think that it's often fun to play with line breaks, right? And be like, well, what if I did it this way? And then you see, and you're like, that's not working. And so kind of making it pull its own weight and earn its place in the poem is a great sort of rule of thumb to go back to, at least that I'll use when I when I return to some of my drafts. Let me see what's going on in the chat. Nadra is asking, how do you know when you have fully developed your distinct voice? It's a great question.
I'm a big believer in writing what you feel like you have to write and not trying to write like, whoever the popular poets are that you like or that are getting a lot of attention right now. I feel like maybe life's too short for that. And you, I'm sure, have things you need to say and ways in which you need to say them. And I think that's probably the key to finding your voice, is just speaking truly from who you are. I guess on the question of voice, there's other people who write like persona poems and use wacky voices at times, but that's not me. So, that wouldn't be true to myself to write those kinds of things and try to like get them out there. So yeah, I think finding your voice is just figuring out what you have to say and how you want to best say it, and not really listening to many other people.
Yeah, I feel like the moments that I've maybe become most frustrated with my poems is when I know I'm trying to sound like someone else, because I love the way that they did it, right? Where I'm like, oh my gosh, I love this poem. I want to write something just like this. And then I do it and it's off because it's not me. And it takes a long time to realize, well, why am I writing like someone else? Like this isn't, I might love that poem because it's theirs, but that doesn't mean that that's how I have to format my writing. But it's hard to get to that point for sure. Let's see. Oh, Dylan's asking a difficult question that Dan, you might pass on. What is your favorite poem you've written? This might be like choosing your favorite pet or your favorite child.
Yeah, that's a hard one. Um, I think I had a poem that was published in Beltway Quarterly a few years ago that was called Anniversary. And I think that's one of my favorites. I had written this poem a long, long time ago when my wife and I first got together, and it never, went anywhere. It just kind of sat in my drafts. And then I revisited it much later after we'd been married for a long time and kind of reworked it. So I don't know that it's my best poem, but I feel like I can track it across my life in a way that I can't with many other things. And it just feels important and intimate and interesting to me in those ways. So that's my personal favorite poem, I think, that I've
Great.
written.
Do you find yourself returning to older drafts, putting them away for a while? I'm just now curious about your drafting process in general.
Yeah, I mean, I keep everything and I hope that eventually I will use it for something. Um, I think I'm an endless tinkerer. Like I'll have a poem from 10 years ago and I'll pull it out and think like, okay, like you were saying, like, let me mess with the lines a little bit and see if anything unlocks here. Or maybe I don't think about that the way I used to, and now I can kind of update it. So I go back to other things frequently, especially when I feel like I can't write anything new. I still want to be productive, so I just go back to what I was doing before. But that does bring up something I thought I might touch on, which was kind of the order that books are published in. And so Subtexts, which is my second published book, was the book that I thought would be my first book, because I thought it's doing something new. People will grab onto this. And for a long time, nobody wanted to grab onto it. And meanwhile, alongside, writing these poems and trying to get them published, I was writing all of these kind of like personal, vulnerable poems where I was just processing my life. And those started to kind of come together in little constellations around different themes. So I put them together and sent out that manuscript, and that got picked up as my first book, Strange Children. My third book, which is coming out later, is actually the first manuscript I wrote and I put aside for a long time, like, I don't know, 5-10 years. And I thought, well, I guess that's not going anywhere. And then last summer, Barrelhouse Writer Camp, I sat down with it and retitled everything and reworked every single poem. And then I sent that out and that got picked up. So the order that things come out in is not necessarily the order they were written in. So I feel like that's the value of going back to your older work, because there's still things there that you can continue to work on and will become your new latest thing, even though it's your oldest thing.
That's awesome. And shout out to Barrelhouse Writer Camp, which is where we first met. And it's just such a beautiful place to really get a lot of work done, but be in community with other writers. So shout out to the camp and everyone at Barrelhouse. I also did want to talk a little bit about publishing, but your approach to publishing individual poems as well, because sometimes it's hard to get longer poems published or maybe more experimental poems published in traditional places because they maybe don't have space or no one's kind of leaping on that. So just how do you approach sending your work out for publication, and in the context of maybe knowing that the books are coming out?
Yeah, so these subtext poems in particular, I feel like were hard to place in magazines because they're long. They're also weirdly laid out. So like it'd be a pain for the designer. if these came into Barrelhouse where I'm the editor, I would probably think twice just on like how difficult it would be to make them look right. When there's so many other good poems in the queue that look normal and would be easy to print, and they wouldn't take up, 10 pages. So I knew that would be a challenge going into it. I wasn't sure how they would work online because I thought like the page separation was important, but it turns out people just added like a big chunk of space and that seemed to work well enough online. But, I knew they weren't poems that were going to end up like in the New Yorker. They had to end up in places that were willing to be a little more risky and do something different. So I looked for more experimental type journals, like Dream Pop Press published one, and Always Crashing was another online magazine that did a great job with them. So you kind of have to know your markets and where you might fit in and who might be interested in this. And that just takes a lot of time and investigation and reading, seeing what's out there.
Yeah, it does take time, finding where your work would be the best fit. It's not always necessarily everyone's like most popular lit mag, but sometimes the smaller ones are the ones who will take care of the work the best and make sure it's published the way you want. So I know there's a bunch of questions in the chat, but I did want to just briefly touch on what you just kind of mentioned a little bit with the physical act of turning the page. I know we talked just a little bit via email before this, and you mentioned that as something that you're consciously thinking about with this collection and maybe your work in general. So could you talk about how the page itself functions for you as part of the work? And maybe, do you think about how a poem is going to fit on the page while you're writing it, or does that come later in the process?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this since we emailed, because I kind of said it was like a half-baked idea that I know it's something I do, but I'm not quite sure how to articulate. And I think when I kind of like tried to sort out the root cause of my interest in this, I think I grew up a huge fan of comic books, and I worked in a comic book store for a long time. And there's kind of a principle in comics, you start reading on the left side and then you get down to the right side on the bottom. If you're going to have a big reveal, it has to come after you turn the page. Because if it's on the bottom of this page, the person's going to see it when they're over here, and then your reveal is ruined, right? So I feel like that act of turning the page and being surprised is very ingrained in me. But for poetry, and I think this applies both to the subtext poems and the longer poems in Strange Children, the act of turning the page on a long poem works very similarly to the line enjambment we were talking about before, where it is an even more substantial moment of pause where you turn the page and you have this opportunity for surprise to change up what you were saying on the previous page or reverse on it or cast it in a new light. So I think that's what I'm trying to do. And I do think about that as I'm writing the poems. I think about it more when I'm sending the poems out and I'm like, is the editor gonna realize this is important to me? Or is it better just to use a section break and have the next section come right after that on the same page? But I feel like the page turn really does do something. And I've been lucky enough to work with publishers who see that and who keep it in there for me, so.
Yeah, because it would be very different, thinking of the longer poems in Strange Children and then in Subtext, if each part was just kind of like, well, how many can we fit on one page? And just kind of squish them together would, you could have some sort of visual break, but it wouldn't have the same effect. And I think, and I was so pleasantly surprised to see that Subtext was so large formatted when it came in the mail today. because I just love the way that that allows the poems to really extend and keep that form, and something that we love about our new like large format for Poet Lore too is that we get to publish poems that do similar work like that. So yeah, very appreciative of the form of the book. So another plug to buy the book so that you all can experience them in their great kind of page turning way. Let me pop back into the chat because I know we've had some questions come in. Cynthia has a bit of a long question, so let me try to condense this a little bit. Have you found yourself thematically erasing, leaning into response, rejection, reclamation of a poetic pronouncement that juxtaposes in such a way that your new poem and previous poem are both enhanced in a way that without each other they wouldn't be? So it sounds like it's talking a little bit about maybe the questions about the interconnectedness between the pieces, or maybe like what came first, chicken or egg, right? Like if is the poems obviously wouldn't have, you wouldn't have the erased poems without the original poem, but is the original poem different because then it's in communication with the erased poems? Maybe that's part of the question. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think maybe it's helpful to kind of reveal my actual process for writing these. So I would write the prose block first, and then I would go back and erase that down to just a few words or a phrase, and then start a new page with just those few words and try to, so what I would do is I'd highlight those words in red, bring in back the full page of text so that I could erase it again, but knowing I had to preserve those words. And then I do it again and again and again, step by step. So the pages do relate to each other. And sometimes they all build off the same idea, just, adding phrases to that phrase. And other times they reverse on that and will change the meaning of the phrase completely. It's kind of like the poem doesn't have to decide whether it wants to mean this or wants to mean this. It has the opportunity to mean both across all of these pages, which I found really liberating and interesting. And it allowed me to kind of, there's like a meditative aspect to it, I think, because you're returning obsessively to the same language and maybe changing your mind a bit as you go. So they definitely interplay with each other and respond and reject what the other pieces are saying.
Yeah, I think that's maybe most apparent in the disagreement one, where it's full of the he said, she said going back and forth, and then you can see it twisting on itself. And I love that thinking of maybe the speaker changing their own views as the poem goes on, or the speakers maybe even changing as each poem kind of shifts. And Shaheen is asking about the themes in the book. So the poems are obviously structurally unified in this form, but are they thematically in conversation with each other? And I know I had also had a question about themes. So could you talk about your approach to the themes in the work and how they're sort of connected, maybe overarching or not?
Yeah. So the book is organized kind of around this form that I've developed. And as far as how I put it together, I kind of wanted the book to teach you how to read it as you went. So the first poem, that face-to-face poem, reads pretty much like a traditional poem, except that you see that these different phrases are repeating. And then we introduce kind of the build up and build down poems. And then it turns into like build up and build down, but they're lineated poems. So they look kind of like regular poems, but combined with this other technique. So that was like the structure of the book. Theme-wise, it's pretty diverse in its themes. There are poems. This fossil record poem kind of traces the history of the earth up until humans arrive. And then there's a later poem in the book that kind of addresses what we've done to the planet since we arrived. So those two poems are connected. And I feel like there are some other poems that are connected, maybe around an idea of being responsible for the choices we make. But there's all kinds of other stuff in there too. There's, you know, a sort of state surveillance poem, and there's love poems. So thematically is not like unified in that way. It's structurally unified.
Yeah, yeah. And I loved the way that it almost felt like the fossil record poem kind of, you know, we left off and then later on we picked back up and we're like, you thought you were done with this, but you know, now you kind of come face to face with the implication of what humanity has done to the planet. And I think, you know, you were talking about the order of these books, you know, in their creation. And I was surprised because this book, it felt so timely to me, like in the erased portions of the Snow Day poem, I felt like the original, like the start of it felt very almost like early pandemic. You know, we stayed home and you know, there's the president coming on and things like that. The notes from the office, and then when you get to the full poem, you're like, oh, it kind of, you know, it shifts the context. But I think that there's a certain timeliness to everything in here, which I really appreciated moving through.
Yeah, that poem is interesting because it's really about the Snowmageddon snowstorm in February of 2010, which was a while ago. So it's interesting how it still applies now and applies differently. Like there's a reference to Civil War in that poem, which, you know, at the time I meant the actual Civil War and not the current political climate, but it certainly feels different now when I read it. So I'm glad you say that it's kind of topical and of the moment, because some of these poems were written quite a while ago. So it's good to hear that they hold up.
Yeah, yeah. It's nice that you have that sort of, you know, thread that even though they were written before, there's still something for everyone to latch on to. It's not like you had a pandemic book in the works for years and then it just happened to come out when we had a pandemic, right? But there's still things that maybe with the current context, readers will impose on the work a little bit more than maybe they wouldn't have before. But it was really interesting to hear you talk about that one, or the book kind of being written not so close to the current time, but it still feels very poignant to a lot of the things. I mean, the climate, you know, is obviously just getting more and more intense. And so those felt very timely. There's just a lot of things. So I hope that people read this book and latch onto those themes as well. Anne-Marie is asking, when writing, what outcome is most important to you once you're finished with a poem? What has gravitated you towards writing poetry as opposed to novels or maybe memoir or something else? And what do you find that most inspires you while creating a poem? These are all very good questions.
I think the outcome most important to me is to move the reader. There's a great essay by Edgar Allan Poe that I think I'm gonna botch the name of it. I want to say it's called something like the Constellation of Poetry. And he basically talks about, in the essay, he walks you through how he wrote The Raven. And there's debate about whether this is actually how he did it or not, or this is just a good essay. But he talks about like first deciding what emotion you want to evoke in the reader, and then thinking about what mood of the poem or story would create that emotion, and then crafting your piece within that kind of mood space. I think that's a little bit clinical. Like, I don't think about what I want the reader to feel. I mean, I want them to feel what I'm feeling pretty much. So, I'm writing from that emotional space, hoping that there's a connection from the other side. But that a poem moves you in some way is my ultimate goal. I'm not as concerned about like getting a particular point across or that kind of thing. It's more about the feeling of it. And as far as why I gravitate towards poetry versus novels or something else, I don't know. I just have always written poetry. I've tried to write some short fiction and plays and things like that, and it never really works for me. It always comes out as a poem, and then I'm trying to fit it in a different container. So I've decided just to stick with what I know. But I think there's a certain, I like how condensed it is, that it's like a one sitting kind of thing. You get an immediate reward or impact from it. So those are some of the things I like about poetry. What inspires me most is a combination of the relationships and people in my real life and reading lots of poetry. I mean, I feel like, you can read a book of poems and come out with 10 ideas for your own poems that will be totally different than what that book of poetry was about. But I don't know, it just stimulates you in such a way that like your brain leaps off into these other areas, and then you get in that kind of flow of things and you start creating. So
yeah, like being in the presence of good art or great poetry makes you want to go create something. It almost like lights that fire to go, get back to the page.
yeah.
So how does your role as an editor impact your writing process? Maybe reading submissions or working one-on-one with poets, just how has that kind of changed the way that you approach your own work?
That's a good question. I feel like it doesn't impact my writing that much, other than just constantly being engaged with poems. You think about like what makes a poem work, and you see what are the common mistakes that poems make, and then to avoid them or catch them in your own work probably before you would have otherwise. I think it's been totally invaluable to the publishing process, knowing what happens behind the scenes and why decisions get made and how subjective it is, and why poems are rejected or accepted. I think if anyone has the opportunity to be a reader at a literary magazine, just do it for a couple months and you'll see all these things that I'm talking about. And it just makes you more realistic, I think, about where your pieces belong. And I don't mean that in like a, aim lower kind of way. I mean, in find the best home for them, which may be a really high profile place, but maybe a really specialized place. And you want to connect with the readers who are going to be receptive to what you're writing. So editing has given me that kind of perspective.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I always tell people is read for a literary journal if you can, if you have the time. I know so many literary journals, we can't afford to pay our readers to do that volunteer work, but once you get into the submissions and you start reading and really seeing those inner workings, I know I felt something just kind of click in the way that I would go back to my own work and be like, okay, if I was reading this as a submission, what would I latch on to? Or even if I just, put a packet of 5 poems together, like which one would I want to put first so that it really makes the reader want to read more? And so I think those things that maybe, I'm sorry, my cat just decided to jump over here. But yeah, those things that really you don't always think about before you're on that other side of the lit mag world is it's really important to get that perspective if you can. All right, Kaylin has a question about sort of stepping away from your work and coming back to it. I have a hard time stepping away from my own poetry and determining a poem as the final version. Have you reread one of your poems that now feels unfinished or needs some changing? If so, how do you deal with that?
That's a good question, because I feel like the final version, I don't know. I don't know how to determine that. There are poems in my books that I think like, oh, maybe I should change this bit. And I will change it when I do a reading of it, because I've decided my new way is better than my old published way. So I think you can constantly continue to revise. It's only unhealthy when that prevents you from, are you just revising because you don't want to move on to the next thing, or are you really revising to try and make it better? Is the more important question than when it's final. Because I don't know, hopefully you publish a lot and then you have like a collected poems someday and you can make changes on that end of it. So I don't know, you just have to get it to a place where you're comfortable with it, and it may have flaws, but you're probably the only person who sees those flaws, to be honest. And you just ask yourself, am I ready to show this to other people and willing to accept whether they like it or not? So I don't know, I think that's an easier approach for me than to say like, this is final and I will never change it again, because I'm always going to want to change it.
Yeah, and I think something that's freeing too is knowing that even though maybe you publish a poem somewhere and then it's part of your book manuscript, you still can change that poem from that first publication to that book manuscript. I think when I realized that, I don't know, when I was in undergrad, I was like, what do you mean you can change it? Like, it's already been published, but it's your poem, so you can keep doing that work and tinkering, a healthy amount of tinkering never hurt anyone or never hurt the poem, right? That's my approach too. I'm such a tinkerer with the words on the page. And it is, I remember going to a reading where the poet was marking out lines. You could see her marking out lines in her own book as she was reading the poem. And I went back to the book after and I was like, she didn't even read this whole page. Like, it's really interesting, what people will do in the moment. And, if you feel like it's not working anymore, there it goes. You just mark it out.
Yeah.
All right, we are getting sadly to the end of our hour. So I just want to get a few more questions in. Do you have any advice to poets putting together a collection now that you have, your third one on the way, which maybe was that first manuscript? Just different approaches to, how do you realize that something is maybe on its way to becoming a manuscript? What steps can you take in that publishing slog before it gets picked up to really get it into shape?
Yeah. The first step is just writing a lot of poems and then kind of seeing what emerges from that. In that way, I think Subtexts is an outlier book, that it's kind of the structurally organized thing. More often, you find manuscripts are successful that are thematically organized in some way. I think even though they're poems, it is helpful to have a kind of narrative arc progression to the collection. It doesn't have to be like an obvious thing, but maybe a relationship comes together and falls apart or something like that. A very simple plot helps keep the reader going, just like it does in short fiction and novels. As an editor, I mean, I tend to like thematically organized books better than just like, here's my 60 best poems kind of books. That can be effective, but those have to be 60 really awesome poems. They can't rely on any of the other poems to kind of like buttress them up. And it is helpful if you can say what your book is about. And it doesn't have to be like a really complicated explanation, but a one sentence, people are going to ask you either way, like, what's your book about? And you should be able to say, it's about this, and that will satisfy them. But, you know, from someone who's trying to sell books, that's like a very important piece of it. As an editor and as a poet who's just out there, being able to say, this is a book about X, or this is a book that is doing this type of thing, is more helpful than saying like, this is a book that considers humanity. You know, like that doesn't really move anybody. So,
right.
Yeah, I mean, just write a bunch of poems that only you can write and see what that says, and then piece them all together. There's no magic to it. It's kind of a grind, and you just, you know, you got to do what you do. Write those poems that are you on the page, and your themes and obsessions will come out from that, and you'll see it and identify it, and then you can start shaping it all together.
Great. Yeah. I think having that, you know, elevator pitch, even for a poetry collection, is so important. It's a lot easier to sell, you know, this book is about XYZ than, well, this is my book of my 50 best poems, but they're all about everything. And I think, you know, that works for some people, but I think especially now with a competitive market and getting the manuscript out, that's really important. All right, for our last question, do you have any specific craft advice or maybe craft books that you recommend or that you find yourself turning to?
I think that my best piece of craft advice is to be easy on yourself and hard on your poems. If you're not someone who writes a poem a day, then don't worry about it and don't try to be that person. You know, write the way that you want to write. But once you have written the poem, make it as good as you possibly can make it, and make the choices that you're comfortable with, that are your choices. You know, people are going to give you advice and feedback, and they're not always right. So do what feels right to you, because you're the artist and you're in charge of what you're producing. As far as craft books go, the Grey Wolf Art of series is pretty amazing, especially for poetry. You know, Art of the Line, Art of Syntax, all these kinds of books break down sort of the piece by piece craft elements. So I really like those. But beyond books, I think the best way to learn is through conversations, and, you know, ask your friends who are writing, how did they do that? Or why did they do that? And find out what are the kind of principles behind why people write the way they write, which just comes across a lot better in a conversation like this one or at a conference. So, you know, I'm an introvert. I don't really like to be out and about, but I do think it's helpful if you can be a little bit bold and get out there to meet some people who, you know, you already love poetry and writing, and they love poetry and writing, so you already have hours and hours of things to talk about, and that's how you'll learn, you know, probably the best way.
Great. Thank you so much. That is a perfect way to wrap up the chat. And thank you, Amy, for putting the link in. Please, please, please purchase a copy of Subtexts, purchase a copy of Strange Children. pre-order when it's available Dan's next book. We're just going to get all the book promo out there. Dan, thank you so much for spending your time with us tonight and for being so generous with your answers. It's really great to dive into the work and to talk to you again. So
yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you to everyone for the awesome questions. I really enjoyed this, and I appreciate getting to unpack all of this because I don't feel like you get to do this at a regular reading. So this was a lot of fun to talk about the nitty-gritty stuff.
yes, yes, and you've been so busy with readings and everything since the book came out. So we appreciate, you squeezing us in. And thank you to our audience for all of your questions and for spending your evening with us when there are probably so many other things pulling your attention away. It's nice to spend 1 hour talking and thinking about poetry with other people. So thank you all and enjoy the rest of your night.